The townsfolk of Ashen Hollow never spoke about the old St. Augustine Chapel after dusk. The narrow cobblestone road leading to its entrance was overrun with ivy, and the stained-glass windows were covered in a thick layer of grime, as if the building itself wished to disappear. Children dared each other to go near it, but none ever made it past the rusted iron gates. It was said that if you stood there long enough, you'd hear the soft sobbing of a woman, the weeping bride. The legend had existed for over a century, passed down in hushed whispers. A young bride, Abigail Moore, was said to have been abandoned at the altar by her fiancé, Thomas Greaves. Distraught, she fled to the bell tower and threw herself from its highest point, her wedding gown billowing like a ghostly shroud as she plummeted to her death. Ever since, her spirit lingered, weeping for the life she would never have, her sorrow echoing through the chapel's hollow corridors. "You're all cowards," Emily said, her voice cutting through the quiet of the autumn evening. She was standing on the edge of the group, her flashlight pointed at the overgrown path leading to the chapel. "It's just a story. Ghosts aren't real." Her friends shuffled nervously. The group of 5 teenagers had decided to spend their Halloween night proving that the weeping bride was nothing more than a tale to scare children. Max, the self-proclaimed leader of their group, adjusted his hoodie and grinned. "All right, Emily," he said. "If you're so brave, why don't you go inside?" Emily raised an eyebrow.
"Fine.
"But you're all coming with me?" The others exchanged uneasy glances. Jenny clutched her jacket tightly around her, glancing at the dark silhouette of the chapel in the distance.
"I don't know, guys.
My grandma used to say that people who go there don't come back the same." "Your grandma also said cats can steal your soul," Max teased. "Come on, Jenny. Don't be lame." Reluctantly, the group moved forward, the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot the only sound as they approached the gate. Emily pushed it open with a groan of metal against metal. The air grew colder, biting at their exposed skin. A shiver ran down Jenny's spine, and she swore she heard a faint, mournful sigh. The interior of the chapel was suffocatingly dark. Their flashlights barely illuminated the pews covered in decades of dust. Cobwebs hung like curtains from the rafters, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. At the far end, the altar stood shrouded in shadow, the once grand crucifix above it tarnished and broken. "This place is disgusting," Max muttered, stepping carefully to avoid a fallen beam. Emily ignored him, her attention drawn to the bell tower. "That's where she jumped," she said, her voice almost reverent. "Can we just look around and leave?" Jenny whispered, her voice trembling. As they explored, the air grew heavier, pressing down on their chests. It was then that they heard a soft, heart-wrenching sob. The sound froze them in place. It wasn't the wind, nor the creak of the old wood beneath their feet. It was unmistakably human. "It's just the wind," Max said, though his voice wavered. "That's not the wind," Jenny hissed, clutching Emily's arm. The sobbing grew louder, echoing through the chapel like a lamentation. Emily shone her flashlight toward the altar, her heart pounding. There, in the dim light, stood a figure dressed in white. The gown was tattered, stained with dark streaks that looked alarmingly like blood. Her veil hung low, obscuring her face, but the sobs came from her direction. Who's there?" Emily called, though her voice cracked. The figure's head snapped up, revealing hollow, sunken eyes that gleamed like embers in the dark. A gaping smile stretched across her pale face as she moved toward them, her feet never touching the ground. "Run!" Max screamed, and the group scattered. Outside, the air was electric with fear. They didn't stop running until they reached Emily's car, gasping for breath. "What the hell was that?" Max yelled, his voice cracking. "It was her," Jenny said, tears streaming down her face. "It was the weeping bride." Emily was silent, her hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. She couldn't shake the image of that smile, that horrifying smile. In the days that followed, strange things began to happen. Emily's mirror cracked without reason, and at night, she heard soft sobbing outside her bedroom window. Max's dog refused to enter his room, barking and growling at something only it could see. Jenny woke up with scratches on her arms, as though unseen hands had clawed at her in her sleep. One by one, they began to unravel. Emily became obsessed, returning to the chapel despite her friends' warnings. She scoured old records, piecing together the story of Abigail Moore. The townsfolk had left out one crucial detail. Abigail hadn't just died that night. Before leaping to her death, she had cursed all who entered her sacred chapel with sorrow and despair. Determined to break the curse, Emily returned to the chapel alone. She carried with her a bouquet of white roses, the kind Abigail had held on her wedding day. The sobbing greeted her as she stepped inside, louder and more anguished than before. "I'm sorry," Emily whispered, placing the roses on the altar. "I'm so sorry for what happened to you." The sobbing stopped. The air grew deathly still. Then, a voice, cold and brittle, spoke from the shadows. "Sorry won't bring him back." Emily turned to see Abigail standing behind her, her eyes filled with endless, consuming sorrow. "What do you want?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "To be remembered," Abigail said. "To be free." With trembling hands, Emily lit a candle and recited a prayer she had found in the chapel's archives. The light flickered, and for a moment, Abigail's form seemed to soften, her ghastly appearance fading. But then, a scream tore through the chapel, and the spirit lunged at Emily. The next morning, Emily's friends found her lying on the chapel floor, unconscious but alive. The bouquet of roses was gone, and the chapel was eerily silent. The sobbing had ceased. Emily never spoke of what happened that night, but she was never the same. The curse had been lifted, but at a cost. The legend of the weeping bride faded from memory. The chapel was eventually demolished to make way for a new town hall. But on quiet nights, when the wind blew just right, some claimed they could still hear the faint sound of a woman crying, carried on the breeze like a haunting lullaby.